Okay, our first speaker this afternoon is a professor, consultant, TEDx speaker, social activist, change agent, and traditional knowledge keeper. He holds a master's in education from SFU, focusing on Indigenous curriculum and instructional design. His experience includes Indigenous education and program leadership from various organizations across colonial Canada. He specializes in the development of educational programs and services with decolonization and reconciliation as its core values. He comes to us with an open heart and an open mind and hopes to be received in the same way. Delegates, please join me in welcoming Len Pierre.
Haichka, thank you so much. Oh my gosh. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And in my language, I would really like to say Ait Swayel, Mietsap Kwa Huilam, Palikulak Telskui, Tsalitzel Kwak Aitsi. Good day, everybody, and welcome. My name is Len Pierre. My ancestral name is Palikulak, and I am Coast Salish from Kaitsi First Nation on my father's side and Musqueam First Nation on my mother's side. Which is one of the host territories that we are gathered on today. I am the owner and CEO of Len Pierre Consulting. We are a tiny but mighty Indigenous consulting group that specialize in education, training, project management, cultural advising, strategic planning. In this case, it's probably easier just to share with you the list of things that we don't do. For teams and organizations all across colonial Canada. I come to you this afternoon with an open heart and an open mind, and I hope to be received in the same way. I share that because I have been invited here this afternoon to share with you what I've come to learn, what me and my team, which I lovingly call my family, what my team and I have come to learn about the importance, the incredible value, and the good work of embedding Indigenous-specific cultural safety into our teams and organizations across this country. I say I come with an open heart and an open mind, and I hope to be received in the same way because it has been my experience that when we show up to spaces like this to do a deeper dive into our learning journey on the colonial history, our shared history as Indigenous and non-Indigenous professionals in this country. It has been my experience that many of us feel like we are put into this place of vulnerability, a zone of fear, and often that fear comes from this place of a fear of the unknown. And for all of my Indigenous colleagues and relatives on the stage here and out in the masses, this is history and emotions and stories that are very near and dear to us. So I say I come with an open heart and an open mind and hope to be received in the same way because I'm going to do a little bit of truth-telling up here. And I'm going to do some truth-telling in a way that I don't mean to blame or shame or traumatize anybody in here, but I want to share with you why Indigenous cultural safety is of just incredible significant value in our shared journey towards reconciliation in this country. With that, it is important to know that reconciliation, these are early days. We are just 3.5, if not 4 years into this journey of reconciliation. And one of the things I always begin by announcing is when we look back at our shared history in this country, it is important to know that genocide, colonialism, and systemic oppression against Indigenous peoples was incredibly strategic, incredibly intentional, and occurred over a very long period of time. Therein, it's only natural that our work, our good work in reconciliation, needs to be equally intentional equally strategic, and occurring over a long period of time. So I share that with you that it's been my experience as well that many of us live in this instant gratification, instant manifestation day and age, right? You think of Uber, skip the dishes, Netflix, or ordering your Christmas shopping online, which I totally regret the day my daughter taught me how to shop online through Amazon. Reconciliation is not going to be expedient. It is not going to be occur overnight because colonialism in this country did not occur overnight. At the end of the day, for each of your respective teams and organizations that are represented here, and for all the good work that you lead in your teams and organizations, this is a marathon, not a sprint. This is about change and transformation over a long period of time. But that should not come at the cost of the urgency, the sense of urgency of today. So I'm not looking for perfection, and I'm not looking at anybody in particular, but I don't know if anybody describes himself as a self-described perfectionist. I'm not looking at anybody in particular, I'm not. But we do have this thing in our work where we get caught up in our sense of perfectionism. And I will begin by letting you know that perfectionism is a sign and a value of colonialism. Just saying, just saying. In colonialism, we always talk about the perfect land, the perfect family, the perfect institution. And this work is not going to be perfect. It's going to be messy, it's going to be sticky, the roads are going to be bumpy, and the waters are going to get choppy. And so I hope to equip you with some knowledge, some greater awareness, and if you will allow, some tools, tips, tricks, and strategies you can take back to your respective organizations to help be the fuel to this journey on reconciliation. So that's why I say I come with an open heart and an open mind. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started into our little PowerPoint presentation I have prepared for each and every one of you. Before I begin, I just want to do a little bit of a poll of the room here because I know there's so many different organizations that are represented in this space. Can I please get a show of hands? How many of you have previously taken an Indigenous cultural safety training in recent years? Ooh, that gives me all kinds of tingly feelings. Thank you for that. And how many of you do you have required or mandated or encouraged, supported education and training programs for your institutions, for your organizations? Oh, I just love that feeling. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I don't know if what I'm sharing with you is anything new. I do not know. If it is new, come talk to me at the end of this keynote. I would love to have the conversation and the dialogue and the feedback. But often for me, this is what is often missing context from other cultural safety education and training programs. For me, as a teacher, it is always important when I am educating very intelligent, very smart, very learned people, professionals who work in very large colonial institutions. Why are we here? Why should we be learning about Indigenous cultural safety? And I don't know if you've heard this or not. If you've heard this, let me know. I encounter this narrative, this dialogue all the time. And that narrative is, why do Indigenous people get special treatment? Have you all heard that? That is a really big issue for reconciliation in this country. It's been my experience that not every Canadian is familiar with the Indigenous experience in this free, progressive, multicultural society. So we need to get over this idea of being uncomfortable with being Indigenous specific. Because I show up to train doctors and nurses, lawyers, social workers, teachers, folks who work in the nonprofit sector, supporting children and youth, and people who are on their healing journey from substance use and addictions. And it's been my experience that we get uncomfortable by talking about Indigenous-specific experiences. So I like to start with why. Why are we here? Why should we be talking about joining the movement for cultural safety across this country? Because it is a movement. And reconciliation is a movement. And the good news is we don't have to be a part of the movement. We get to be a part of it. We get to be a part of the change-making and the history-making in this country. Because for the first time ever in the history of this country, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people are finally in the same canoe, paddling in the same direction. And that fills me with a lot of hope, a lot of faith for the future that we are all creating together. And much of that has to do with the work that you're doing here at this convention. So why are we here? It is important to know, and I don't know if anybody, has anybody ever seen this slide of ours before for cultural safety on socialization? Anybody in the audience? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Here's what we describe as why we're here. When I first started this work for building cultural safety education and training programs that eventually would lead to developing a consulting company for it, was why does Canada have such an anti-Indigenous sentiment in this country? Why is Canada so anti-Indigenous? And as a teacher, when I'm developing curriculum, I'm always like, I need to know why. I need to know why. I need to figure out the epicenter to this problem. And I do say that with the firm solidarity that as Indigenous peoples, we are not the only peoples to experience racism and discrimination in this country, are we? No. We share that horrible experience with many marginalized, targeted, vulnerable, and oppressed groups in this country. If you identify as a woman, I can safely say you've experienced gender discrimination. You, being you, walking in your personal life or your professional life, have probably been treated differently because you identify as a woman. If you identify as gay, lesbian, trans, queer, bisexual, two-spirit, non-binary, non-conforming, I can safely say you've experienced discrimination based solely on who you are, walking in this walk of life in this country. If you identify as a person of color, or what I like to call the global majority, I can safely say you've experienced discrimination based on the color of your skin. But there is no arguing that there is an overwhelming overrepresentation of anti-Indigenous sentiment in this country. And I wondered for the longest time, about 8 years ago, what is the source of this issue, this problem in Canada? And I got it when I read this quote here, and I get a little bit emotional every time this image comes up in our curriculum now, because the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair has recently passed, who was a trailblazer for many of us here on the stage, and many of you who are sitting in the audience. And magnificently, he still continues to trailblaze in the spiritual realm. But the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair had this quote that I read, and when I read this quote, I was like, mind blown. I was like, aha, this is the source of our problem in Canada. And the quote goes, while Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools, when we were told that we were heathen, savages, pagans, and inferior people, that same message was being delivered in the public schools of this country. I call that socialization, colonial socialization. This is why we are here. This is why we are having this conversation. And this is why every moment and every strategy, idea, plan that you advocate for and help advance in your teams and organizations to embed cultural safety is the medicine to this colonial socialization. And we know a thing or two about socialization in this country. We know a thing or two because if you've ever had a loved one, a friend, a family member, or maybe yourself when you are pregnant and expecting a baby, right? And when baby is born, what color do we associate with baby boys in this country? Blue, right? And what color do we associate with baby girls who are born? Pink. And where's the rule book on that? Why do we do that, right? And when baby boy grows up and becomes 1 year old, and we go shopping for baby boy at the toy aisle section in your local shopping mall, what toys do we affiliate with young boys in this country? Trucks, superheroes, tools, right? And it's arguably where you'll find the most weapons in the toy section as well. Now, when you go down the next toy aisle section, where it looks like a bottle of Pepto-Bismol has exploded, what toys do we associate with young girls in this country? Dolls, Barbies, cleaning supplies, baking and sewing, right? And socialization can be a problem because when baby boy finally grows up, becomes a man and a father of his own, and we make fun of him for holding his baby like what? A football? right? So socialization can be incredibly problematic in this country. It's the same thing for anti-Indigenous sentiment in this country. Reconciliation, decolonization, and embedding cultural safety into our teams and organizations is about addressing the harms of colonial socialization. Now, I don't take it for granted that we are all familiar with just how much anti-Indigenous colonialism we've been exposed to. But what you see on the screen here is just a snippet of what's out there that we've been exposed to. I don't know what generation you have grown up in, what region of the country you grew up in, or even what part of the planet you were born in, but all of us as Canadian citizens today have experienced some degree of anti-Indigenous socialization. For the purposes of time, I don't have the time to go through each and every one of these images that you see on the screen here. But two that I very much like to speak to are, we're all familiar with the sports mascots, right? You're all familiar with sports mascots. The problem with Indigenous sports mascots is, number one, we're not a mascot. Number two, they are displays of cultural appropriation, which is defined as the theft and removal of one culture from another dominant culture. And number three, they're also displays of what I call cultural humiliation. It's quite humiliating when a non-Indigenous person thinks they can dress up and be Indigenous for one night out of the year. It's also humiliating when, we have very large teams and organizations who, paint us in these very racist and stereotypical images and affiliate them with sports teams. Now, of course, these sports mascots are housed and affiliated with sports teams, but who houses these sports teams? Which institution houses sports teams, especially in the United States? Colleges and universities. And who goes to college and university? We do. The future professionals of a society are going to an institution that is giving us the subliminal messaging that that's okay. That it's okay to paint us as an other, that is something of the past, or some cartoon fictional character. Very, very problematic. And again, relentless subliminal messaging we're picking up over the years. The top right-hand image is taken from what Justice Murray Sinclair was talking about. This is a snippet taken from an actual Canadian history textbook called Breastplate and Buckskin that was used in Canadian history curriculum for for many decades, from the 1950s onwards here in Canada. What do you notice the Indigenous peoples are being portrayed as in this image? Devils, demons, this demonization of Indigenous peoples. It was literally taught in the Canadian history curriculum. And then one that I like to talk about because I am a millennial. I am 38 years old, I think. I say I think because COVID has really thrown me through this time warp. I forget what year it is, how old I am, and how long I've been doing certain things. And so as a child, when I was coming up as a child in the late 1900s, in the 1990s, I remember watching the Bugs Bunny and Tweety show religiously every Saturday morning in my pajamas, eating my cereal on the living room floor. And I remember seeing this episode of the Bugs Bunny and Tweety show. Has anybody seen this episode of the Bugs Bunny and Tweety show? I'm seeing quite a few of us. Okay. If you have not seen this episode of the Bugs Bunny and Tweety show, here's what goes down in this episode. In this episode of the Bugs Bunny and Tweety show, Bugs Bunny is shooting and killing off the Native American Indians. Because you see, the Native American Indians are attacking the fort. Why they're attacking the fort, I have no idea. They probably just want their land back. They're attacking this fort. They're throwing bow and arrows, or they're throwing tomahawks at poor little Bugs Bunny's head. They're shooting bow and arrows at him. You hear this powwow music, bum, 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 in the background. And Bugs Bunny, as this Lone Ranger, is shooting and killing off the Indians. Only as he's shooting and killing the Indians, he's singing this song. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians. 4 little, 5 little, 6 little Indians. And for every Indian he killed, he would tally it on a scoreboard next to where he was stationed. He would then go on to say, oh, never mind, that one was a half-breed, and wipe away half of a mark. What kind of messages do you think children across this country are learning or picking up about Indigenous peoples when they're watching a cartoon episode like that? What messages are they picking up about Indigenous peoples in this episode? That we're dangerous, that we're disposable, that we're enemies of humanity, and enemies of the state. Because who do you think Bugs Bunny represents in this episode? He's your everyday American man, right? He's got this cowboy suit looking uniform on, and he's got a rifle. So it's very, very problematic. I call this socialization because we've all been exposed to some degree of colonial socialization, which is an anti-Indigenous narrative. Relentless in nature, happening less and less today, of course, but many of us, this has been our Indigenous education, especially depending on which generation you've grown up in. And I hate to get political up here, but there are some politicians and very powerful people in this country where this is the source of what they've learned about Indigenous people. And then we come to them and we ask them to endorse cultural safety plans for the entire organization. This is where resistance comes from. This is where denialism comes from. This dehumanization of Indigenous peoples, it's built into colonial infrastructures, because Canada is not the only colonial infrastructure and colonial state across the planet. Further to other examples of colonial socialization, you've all heard of the children's game, Cowboys and Indians, right? It really depends on the generation you've grown up into. Maybe my fellow millennials maybe did not play that, but it does also depend on the geographic region you grew up in as well. Very problematic. The top center image here is referring to a very violent, horrific time of genocide in the United States. If you have ever heard of the term redskin, the origin of the term redskin is referring to a time where there used to be a bounty placed on Indigenous lives. So settlers who were settling from east to west on Turtle Island, if they shot and killed an Indian dead, scalped that Indian, and took the scalp into the fort, they were paid a $200 bounty per scalp. So genocide against Indigenous peoples was incentivized in this country. And redskin is a term that's still widely used in pop culture. Other examples of animated film, White Parents for Indian Orphans, and of course, if you look at the television, news, and media until just the last 7 years, they have always portrayed Indigenous peoples as angry people you have to watch out for. Watch out for those Indians, they're marching. Watch out for them, they're protesting, they're blockading again, they shut a road down, and it was always like stoking the flame of tension between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. So that's a lot, I know, and I'm gonna grab a glass of water and catch my breath. And I want you to take just 3 minutes here, just 3 minutes, to turn to your neighbor and offer a reaction to what you just heard or learned. And 3 minutes goes by very, very fast, I know, but I just want you to check in with your fellow colleague here who you're sitting beside. What's resonating for you? Is a memory surfacing? Is a question? A doubt? Anger? Frustration? 3 minutes goes by very quickly. There are lots of you and one of me. So when I call you back in 3 minutes, I'm gonna shout waterfall, and I want you all to make the sound of what a waterfall makes. What sound does a waterfall make? Oh, I love that sound. And if you can use too, just to get moving a little bit, a waterfall goes like this. So can you all go waterfall, shh. Okay, so take 3 minutes, turn to your neighbor, and I'll call us back in 3 minutes by calling waterfall. Haichka. Thank you all so much for participating in that. Hopefully that was just a really great check-in moment with your peer, your friend, your colleague who you're sitting beside, and just really process, digest. I know that was a lot. That's a lot to take in. And we're just in the final home stretch here of my particular keynote, and I'm aiming to leave around 10 or 15 minutes for any questions. As a teacher, one of my favorite things is responding to questions. And I feel like in today's day and age, which I call the era of truth and reconciliation, with this mandate to engage in reconciliation or embed cultural safety throughout all of our colonial institutions, there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot to ask about, and there's a lot of questions out there. So I just want to give you the heads up. If there are any questions that are coming up for you in the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to invite you up to any one of the standing mics that we have on the floor. And there's no such thing as a silly question. It's one of my favorite things. But further to why we're here, I just want to give you some more things to think about and walk away with to the incredible work that you do in your teams and organizations. Socialization does not exist on its own. It is arguably why we are here, though. We get socialization through our school, our peers and our friends, the news and media, the many myths you hear about Indigenous people. And there's like 100 different myths out there about us, isn't there? Right? We hear them all the time. We grew up with them. The myth that we all get a free education. There's no such thing as free anything in this country. I keep looking for where they're handing out all this free stuff, and I can't find it. But there is no such thing as free education for Indigenous people. There are government subsidies, but those government subsidies are nowhere near adequate, accessible, or even equitable, given the long-withstanding residential schools legacy in this country. And did you know that not every Indigenous child in this country has access to a full K-12 education? Did you all know that? In the northern parts of this country, some First Nations communities, their band-run schools only operate from kindergarten to grade 7. If your child wants to complete a high school graduation, imagine them moving out of the house at 13 years old to go down south to the most northern community that offers a grade 8 to grade 12 education just to complete your high school. But the dominant narrative in this country is, well, they all get free education, right? Or the myth that we have a genetic predisposition towards alcohol or addiction. It's false. It's misinformation. As Indigenous peoples, here's a fun fact, Indigenous peoples in Canada actually have the highest rates of abstinence compared to any other ethnic or racial group in Canada. But the dominant narrative is, oh, there's some alcohol problems there. Or the myth that we don't pay taxes. We pay taxes, right? So it's all myths and misinformation. The real question to think about is, what is the function of those myths? It's colonial socialization, and it's widespread throughout Canada. Family narratives, my running inside joke is every single one of us in this room have at least one racist relative who says really inappropriate things at the family gatherings. I have them in my family. I know them. You have them in your family, right? These are the relatives that will speak up at the family gatherings and say something really inappropriate, and we all roll our eyes. We're like, oh my God, you can't say things like that, right? The problem with racist family narratives is that young people are listening, young people in the family who think that that's okay. And we pass on socialization laterally and then intergenerationally in our families as well. Segregation and, of course, forced erasure of Indigenous peoples. Unaddressed socialization will give way to stereotypes. Unaddressed stereotypes will give way to prejudice. And prejudice will give way to discrimination. Now, prejudice, by definition, is internalized judgments that we have about other people's cultures. Discrimination is external. It's where we treat people differently because of our prejudice beliefs. Now, I will offer you a cultural safety tool here, and this I invite you to add to your professional tool belt moving forward. It is one of my favorite cultural safety tools, and that is harnessing your own prejudice. It sounds ridiculous, hey? Harnessing your own prejudice. In Canada, we kind of create this negative connotation to the word prejudice. We associate it as a bad thing, right? We say, prejudice is bad, so don't be a bad person. Don't be a bad worker, and don't have prejudice. What we're failing to educate ourselves as professionals is with the fact that prejudice is natural, prejudice is innate, it is inside every single one of us as human beings, and it is 100% impossible to be without prejudice. Why? Because we're only born into one cultural framework, and that's the framework of our caregivers, right? For the vast majority of us, you have a mom and you have a dad. Often they come from the same cultural framework. They get together and they have you, and then they raise you in that cultural framework. So every culture you meet from externally, from your cultural framework, you're gonna have judgments about that culture, right? Take this for example. By a show of hands, how many of you have ever been to the United States before? Raise your hand, way up. Keep your hand up. Question for you all. Ever have a judgment about American culture? I rest my case. So we need to stop asking ourselves if we are prejudiced and start asking ourselves, how am I being prejudiced? How am I being prejudiced in this conference? How am I being prejudiced in this team meeting, within negotiations? How am I being prejudiced when I'm dropping my children off at school? How am I being prejudiced when I'm standing in the lineup at the grocery store to pay for my groceries? If you can train yourself to ask this question on a daily, how am I being prejudiced, it will transform the way you interact with your fellow human beings. And it will put you into this zone of critical self-reflection where you can be with your biases. You can question your exposure to colonial socialization and take a critical examination of what your next safest step forward might be. Further to why we're here, yes, clap, yes, please, thank you. I talk really, really fast, and when you clap, I get to go to catch my breath. Further to why we're here, and I'm not going to spend too much time here for the purpose of time, but we do need to honor and recognize that we do live in a colonial country. And the reason I wanted to share this slide with you is just how colonial our country really is. And I say this to get around this pitfall I find a lot of teams or organizations falling into. And that pitfall is where people use proximity to either engage or disengage with cultural safety or reconciliation. I've seen countless organizations, many of them were resistant clients of mine, who will say, Len, we don't need any reconciliation. And like, I have a big ego, right? So I'm like all brokenhearted. I'm like, oh my God, why? Why do you say that? Doctors have even told me this. Doctors have come up to me and they're like, Len, we don't need any cultural safety training. And I'm like, well, why is that? And this doctor looked me dead in the face and said, we don't have any Indigenous patients who are coming to our clinic. And I was like, you're not the slightest bit worried or concerned or wondering why no Indigenous patients are coming to your clinic? And that doctor was like, oh, well, when you put it that way, I'm like, proximity to Indigenous peoples is irrelevant to reconciliation. Nowhere in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action does it say you need to know an Indigenous person to engage in reconciliation. Reconciliation is not about being a good person. It's not about being kinder towards Indigenous people or praying for Indigenous people or being more respectful to Indigenous people. You should already be good people, right? We should already be good people. This has nothing to do with being kind or respectful. Reconciliation is about systemic change and transformation, and we all live and work in those systems. And if we're not in the business of change and transformation, we might be perpetuating the problem. Just saying, it's been my experience. And that's why I always say solidarity is so important to me, because I know that you are in the business of change and transformation. I'm just gonna say it, I know I'm speaking to a room full of converted, right? Preaching to the converted, singing to the choir. But I'm equipping you with language and ideas and tips and tricks for how I engage in this conversation with organizations across this country. The image that you see on the screen here are the systems that scaffold our colonial country, our healthcare system, education, justice, and our social services system. This is the temple that keeps Canada going. Canada as a colonial country is built on colonial ideology. By definition, colonial ideology is the idea that Indigenous peoples are less deserving, less worthy people. It sounds harsh, it sounds brash, but it's ultimately how colonial countries could be born. Canada would not exist as a country if early settlers came into our territory hundreds of years ago and said, you know what? We just need to respect the human rights and the human dignity of these local Indigenous people. Canada never would have been born with that mentality. It can only exist with the idea that Indigenous people are less deserving, less worthy people. So it's only natural that every system that now scaffolds this country will have residual effects of colonial ideology that lingers. This is why cultural safety can be, and I'm fully convinced that it is, the medicine. It's the antidote to colonial ideology and colonial socialization. Under the pyramid, under the temple you see there are examples of anti-Indigenous laws and anti-Indigenous legislation in this country. The Indian Act, which I call the most racist piece of legislation that exists on the planet today, is not on the other side of the planet. It's not in some war-torn country or developing country. The most racist piece of legislation that exists on the planet today is right here in Canada. governing more than 640 different First Nations groups in this country. The residential schools did not happen willy-nilly. It was built into law and legislation, the Civilization Act, the Bill of Rights. These are all examples of anti-Indigenous laws in Canada. And I don't know if you've encountered this before, or maybe it's just me and the work I do, but have any of you in your travels or in your conversations with colleagues in other sectors come up with this denial that, like, there's no such thing as systemic racism in Canada? Have you heard that? Right? Is it just me? You know? There are very powerful people who will make that claim, right? Do you all remember the murder of George Floyd, right? In 2020, the summer of 2020, that sparked a lot of conversation here in the RCMP in Canada. And very brave, very uninformed RCMP police chiefs came before a television and news press conference briefing and said, there's no such thing as systemic racism in the RCMP.
Yeah.
Joyce Ekwon, do you all know the name Joyce Ekwon? This is a name I know, and I feel like you should know it too. Joyce Ekwon was the young Indigenous woman who passed away in a Quebec hospital. She was the one that went live over her Facebook and documented the racist treatment she received by nurses who were supposed to be saving her life. In the days following her death, again, very brave, very uninformed, Premier of Quebec and Minister of Health of Quebec came before the masses in another television conference briefing and declared there's no such thing as systemic racism in the Quebec healthcare system. What that tells me is that very powerful leaders are simply uninformed. Powerful opinions, uninformed. They have no clue about the colonial country that we all live, work, and play in. This is why I wanted to share this screen. And I'm coming up on time. I know it seems very doomy and very gloomy, right? And it's never all doom and gloom with me, okay? There is some good news. In fact, there's a lot of good news. The fact that we are here on this stage, right, doing the work that we are doing in solidarity and unity and allyship with the work that you are doing for equity, diversity, inclusivity, and all of the movements that we are doing to build a better workforce, a better movement, and a better country for our future generations and today's generations is no small thing. There's a lot of good news. The examples that you have on the screen here are just a snippet of really great movements that are happening across this country. We have the emergence of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which was a game changer in this country. The fact that I could build a career talking about reconciliation and racism, let alone a company out of it, is huge. And me and my team of 35 Indigenous consultants have a hard time keeping up with the demand for our work across the country, which is a good problem to have. Thank you. We have the transformation of our BC school curriculum here in this province, where I'm joined with many of my friends and colleagues from the education sector. That was a big game changer too. Oh, hi, hello. Oh my God, there's lots of you. Love you all. I didn't know you were all over there. Oh, sorry. In our culture, we're all about relationships and connection. And so, this was a really big game changer because we have people that are in university today who are coming from that curriculum change that happened in 2015, 2016, 2017. And one day, in the very near future, they're going to be sitting in rooms with us, doing this good work as well. There's not just light at the end of the tunnel, there's like beaming in this tunnel of change and transformation. That's what helps me sleep at night. We have the mandate of colleges and universities to decolonize their practices, the emergence of the National Health Standardization. We have UNDRIP in this province, the emergence of the First Nations Health Authority, land back, which is already happening at this very moment, and of course a renewed commitment from the news and media to advance stories of reconciliation and showing and being a constellation of the way forward. Last slide, I promise you, and then I'm going to zip it, and then I'm going to welcome people. If you have questions, please let me know by standing and getting closer to a mic, just so I know how much time I want to leave for Q&A. I will leave you with this slide here. Here's my next cultural safety tool I will offer you. The greatest cultural safety tool you can add to your professional tool belt is training yourself as a leader to constantly examine and re-examine your own language and behavior. Your own language and behavior. If you can constantly check in whenever you're talking about or working on anything Indigenous, asking myself, was my language okay back there? Was my behavior okay? You're going to be magic in your journey towards reconciliation and cultural advocacy. I'm very worried about people who are unafraid and assume that their language is totally okay. These are people who are like, I got it. I'm the safest guy around these parts. I'm like, hold up, get back here. I think we need some more cultural safety training for you. This is why we need cultural humility as a part of that equation. So what are those examples of behaviors? We want to avoid the zone of what I call the tyranny of efficiency, which is business as usual. And those behaviors look like superiority, apathy, dominating, saviorism, censoring, remaining silent, consuming, being aggressive or violent in their treatment towards the good work of reconciliation and cultural safety. And you can name these behaviors when you're working with leaders, with policymakers, change agents who can sometimes blockade or roadblock really good work from happening. We need to be able to name those behaviors that are oppressive in nature. And rather, we want to aspire towards the zone of transformation, where we're exercising humbleness, humility, allyship, we lean in, we ask questions, and we own our feelings on this journey of cultural safety. These are just opportunities. I'll let you know if you like these slides. I'm not going to skip over them because that's a big breaking a teacher rule of mine. If you like these slides, I will let you know where you can find them. But here's the 4 Ps where I'm often encouraging organizations to take a critical environmental scan of where they can embed cultural safety. No matter what your professional domain is, we all have these 4 Ps. Your professional practice, your physical places, your processes, the way you hire and fire people, conduct your team meetings, and of course, the way you develop policies in your organization. These are the 5 tools for your tool belt I've shared with you. These are just summary. Train yourself to examine and re-examine your own language and behavior. Check in with your prejudices. Don't pretend they're not there. Ask yourself, how am I being prejudiced? Not if you are. Number 3, I got this one from Yoda himself, the Jedi Master. Pass on what you have learned. Don't be stingy with your teachings. That's what our elders have been telling us for generations. Number 4, aspire to be an ally. You do not need to be Indigenous to talk about Indigenous things, just like you don't need to be a woman to be a feminist. And number 5, nobody's asking you to take on the world or change and take down these systems alone. What we're really looking for here is a small commitment to change and transformation. And if you're working on one little bit of change and transformation, all of our little bits add up to a broader whole, and that whole is the movement for reconciliation. So I will leave you with this quote and open up the floor to our friends and colleagues who are on the floor who have some good questions on their heart and mind. And I will leave you with this quote on the topic of cultural safety, that safety is not in the absence of threat, it is in the presence of connection. Haichka Siem, thank you so much for my presentation format. Haitsepka.